Hey loves, it's your girl from Mini Fable Fever. This story is absolutely insane. You guys are not ready for this one.
My sister-in-law thought she can have my position and tried to take my shares in the family company. She went nuts at Christmas. My family owns a construction supply company that my grandfather started in 1971. My father took over in the 90s and turned it into one of the biggest distributors in our region. We have 2 warehouses and contracts with builders across 3 counties. I grew up around that business. I spent my summers there from the time I was 14. I swept floors and organized inventory and learned how to read invoices before I learned how to drive. When I graduated college with a degree in business management, I came back and started working full-time in operations. My brother Oakley is 2 years older than me, and he never wanted anything to do with the company. He went into teaching, and he was happy with that. Nobody had a problem with it. My father respected his choice, and so did I. Then Oakley married Tamsin. Tamsin came from a completely different background. She grew up without much, and I never held that against her. When Oakley brought her to her first family dinner, she was polite and quiet, and I liked her. That lasted about 6 months. The shift happened when Tamsin found out what the company was worth. I don't know who told her. Maybe Oakley mentioned it, or maybe she looked it up. But the second she understood the numbers, everything about her changed. She started showing up to family dinners with opinions about the business. She'd ask my father about quarterly earnings in the middle of passing bread. She'd ask me how many new contracts we signed that month while we were watching football. She started referring to the company as our family business, even though she had never set foot inside either warehouse. She told her own friends she was part of a family empire. She changed her social bio to include the company name like she was on the board. At one of Oakley's co-worker dinners, she apparently told a table full of teachers that her husband's family owned one of the largest construction supply companies in the region, and that she was being groomed for a leadership role. Oakley told me about it later and laughed nervously like it was just Tamsin being Tamsin. I didn't laugh, because I knew what she was doing. She was building a public identity around a company she had no role in, so that when she eventually made her move, there would already be a version of reality where she belonged there. At first, I thought she was just trying to connect with my dad's world. Then she started pushing harder. She walked into my father's office on a Wednesday without an appointment and handed him a resume. She had 3 years of retail experience at a clothing store, where she'd been a sales associate, and a certificate in bookkeeping from an online course she finished in 6 weeks. The certificate cost $400. I know because she asked Oakley to pay for it, and he mentioned it to me casually like it was a normal thing for his wife to be doing. She told my father she wanted to run the accounting department, not work in the accounting department, run it. Our accounting department had 2 full-time certified professionals who had been there for over a decade. One of them, a woman named Gloria, had a master's degree in forensic accounting and had caught a $47,000 billing discrepancy 3 years earlier that saved us from a supplier who was double invoicing us. The other had been with my grandfather. These were serious people doing serious work, and Tamsin wanted to walk in with a 6-week online certificate and manage them. My father told her he appreciated her interest, but there were no open positions, and the department was fully staffed. Tamsin took that as a personal attack. She went home and told Oakley that my father was shutting her out of the family. Oakley called my dad and asked him to give Tamsin a chance. My dad said there was nothing to give her a chance at. The job didn't exist. Tamsin didn't stop. She started showing up at the main warehouse during work hours wearing business clothes like she had a meeting. She'd walk around and ask employees questions about their departments like she was conducting some kind of audit. She brought my father lunch twice, and both times she sat in his office for over an hour talking about growth strategies she read about online. She told him the company needed a fresh perspective and that she could bring new energy. One of our foremen asked me who she was, and I told him she was my brother's wife, and he said, well, she told me she was the owner's daughter-in-law and that she was shadowing operations this quarter. She gave herself a title and a timeline that nobody offered her. Things got worse around the holidays. My father always hosted a big dinner at his house on Christmas Eve, and that year he made an announcement. He said that after a lot of thought and planning with his attorney, he was gifting me a 15% ownership stake in the company. He said I had earned it through 10 years of hard work, and that he was proud of the woman I became. My mother smiled and squeezed my hand. Oakley stood up and hugged me. He told me I deserved it, and he meant it. Tamsin sat completely still. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. She stared at my father like he had just slapped her. Then she looked at me and said, what about Oakley? My father said Oakley would always be taken care of, but that the company shares were going to the person who built their career in the company. Tamsin said that wasn't fair. She said Oakley was the firstborn, and that in most families the oldest son gets the business. My father told her this wasn't most families, and that the business went to whoever earned it. Tamsin stood up and said, so 10 years of me supporting this family means nothing. My father looked at her and said, Tamsin, you've been in this family for 2 years. She told him she had been helping behind the scenes and that nobody acknowledged her contributions. My mother asked what contributions. Tamsin couldn't name one. She looked at Oakley and told him to say something. Oakley looked at her and said, my sister works there, Tamsin. She's been there since she was a kid. This is hers. Tamsin grabbed her coat and walked out. Oakley followed her. They sat in the car for about 20 minutes and then they came back inside. Tamsin didn't say another word for the rest of the night. After Christmas, Tamsin tried a different approach. She went directly to Oakley. She told him that the share transfer wasn't just about me. me. She said it was about their future and their children's future, and that by not fighting for a stake in the company, Oakley was letting his family down. She told him that if he truly loved her, he would demand equal ownership. She used words like legacy and birthright and entitlement, and she used them so often that Oakley started repeating them. By January, Oakley called my father and asked for a meeting. I wasn't invited. I found out about it later from my mother, who overheard the whole thing from the kitchen. Oakley told our father that he'd been thinking about the company and that he felt the share distribution should be equal. He said he understood that I had put in the work, but that blood was blood, and that as the oldest son, he should have been offered something. My father asked him if those were his words or Tamsin's. Oakley didn't answer. My father said, "I've known you your whole life, and you have never once expressed interest in this company. You chose teaching. You told me you were happy. Now suddenly you want equal ownership, and the timing happens to coincide exactly with your wife finding out what the business is worth." My father was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke the way contractors talked about load-bearing walls, factual, measured, and the facts he laid out that afternoon were structural enough to end the conversation. He told Oakley that the ownership decision was final, that the shares were mine, that Oakley would always be taken care of financially through the family trust, which had been established years ago and included a generous provision for both children, but that the company, the operations, the decision-making, the equity was going to the person who showed up every day for 10 years and earned it. Oakley left that meeting and didn't call any of us for 2 weeks. My mother was upset. She called me crying one night and said, "This is tearing us apart." I said, "Mom, I didn't do anything." She said she knew that. She said she was just scared of losing Oakley. I told her she wasn't losing Oakley. She was watching Oakley get managed by someone who wanted access to something she didn't build and was willing to damage every relationship in the family to get it. My mother said that's a strong statement. I said it's an accurate one. In February, Tamsin escalated again. She showed up at the warehouse while I was running a quarterly inventory audit with our logistics team. She walked in wearing heels on a concrete floor and asked to speak with me privately. I told her I was working. She said it would only take a minute. I stepped outside with her because I didn't want a scene in front of my employees. She said she had been doing research and that as Oakley's wife, she believed she had a claim to a portion of the company through marital property rights. She said she had spoken to a lawyer. She said the lawyer told her that because the company was a family asset and because Oakley was a direct descendant, there were grounds to argue that the share transfer to me was an attempt to dilute Oakley's inheritance. She said all of this in the parking lot of a warehouse where I had spent a decade building relationships with every supplier, every contractor, and every driver who pulled in and out of those loading docks. She said she wanted 30%, not for herself, for Oakley. She kept saying for Oakley like she was being selfless, for Oakley, like the man who never wanted the business was suddenly being cheated out of it, like the man who chose teaching because he loved it was now a victim of the sister who chose construction supply because she loved it too. 30% of a company worth several $1,000,000. She said the number like she was asking me to pass the salt. I asked her if Oakley knew she was here. She said of course he does. She said they discussed it and agreed this was the best approach. The best approach. Cornering me in a parking lot during a workday to demand a third of a business she'd never worked a single hour in, that was the best approach. I called Oakley right there in front of her. He picked up and I said, "Did you send Tamsin to my warehouse to demand 30% of the company?" He was quiet for about 5 seconds, and then he said she told me she was going to talk to you about it. I said, "Did you ask her to?" He said, "Not exactly." I said, "Oakley, did you or did you not ask your wife to come to my place of work and threaten me with a lawyer?" He said, "Nobody's threatening anyone." I said, "She just told me she spoke to an attorney about claiming a share of the business through marital property rights. Is that not a threat?" He didn't have an answer. I told him I loved him and that I always would, but that if his wife came to my warehouse again, I would have security escort her off the property, and if she wanted to pursue this legally, she could direct her attorney to ours. Then I hung up and went back inside and finished the inventory audit because I had work to do. That evening, I called my father and told him everything Tamsin had said in the parking lot. He listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he said one word, "Good." I said, "What do you mean, good?" He said, "I've been waiting for her to say it out loud so I could respond officially." He said he'd already spoken to our family attorney after Christmas because he saw this coming. He said the attorney had reviewed the share transfer, the company's operating agreement, and the family trust documentation. The transfer was airtight. It was structured as a gift with full tax documentation filed. The company was an LLC, and the operating agreement explicitly stated that membership interests could not be transferred to anyone outside the existing members without unanimous consent. Oakley was not a member. Tamsin was not a member. Oakley's only financial connection to the company was through the family trust, which my father controlled as trustee. There was nothing for Tamsin's attorney to claim. There was nothing for Oakley to demand. The company was structured the way my father built everything, carefully, with documentation, with every wall load-bearing. My father sent a letter to Tamsin through our attorney. The letter was 3 pages long, and it explained in plain language that the share transfer was legally sound, that the company's operating agreement did not provide for inheritance-based claims, that marital property law did not apply to a business interest gifted to a non-spouse family member, and that any further attempts to assert a claim would be met with a formal cease and desist. The letter also noted that Tamsin's visits to the warehouse without authorization could be considered trespassing on on commercial property, and that the company reserved the right to restrict access. He also included a summary of the family trust provisions, which showed that Oakley was already set to receive a distribution of $200,000 upon my father's retirement, and an additional provision in the estate plan worth roughly the same amount. Tamsin had been fighting for access to a company that was worth considerably more than what Oakley was already guaranteed to receive through channels that didn't require anyone to show up at a parking lot with a lawyer's phone number. She just didn't know it because she never asked, and nobody told her because she had never earned the conversation. She'd spent 2 years trying to get in through the window when there was already a door with Oakley's name on it. She just didn't know it was there because she was too busy trying to kick mine down. The letter arrived on a Thursday. By Friday evening, Oakley was at my parents' house alone, without Tamsin. My mother said he sat at the kitchen table for a long time and didn't say much. Then he told my father he was sorry. He said he let Tamsin get in his head. He said he never cared about the company, and that watching me build my career there was one of the things he was most proud of. He said he should have shut it down the first time she brought it up, and he didn't, because she made him feel like he was failing his future family by not fighting for more. My father told him there's nothing wrong with teaching. He said your sister runs the business because she loves it. You teach because you love it. Both of those things matter, but the business is not a birthright. It's a job, and nobody who hasn't done the job gets to own the job. Oakley said he understood. He asked about the trust, and my father explained the full terms for the first time. Oakley's eyes went wide when he heard the $200,000 figure. He said I didn't know it was that much. My father said I know you didn't, because you never asked about money. That's one of the things I've always respected about you. The implication was clear. Oakley never asked because he didn't care. Tamsin asked because she did. And the difference between those two impulses was the entire problem. Oakley went home and apparently told Tamsin about the trust and the letter and the legal reality of the situation. I don't know exactly what was said between them, but I know the fallout. Tamsin called my mother the next day and told her that the family had made its choice and that she would remember it. My mother said, "What does that mean?" Tamsin said it means I know where I stand. My mother, who had been patient through all of this, who had mediated and stayed quiet and tried to keep peace for months, who had cooked Tamsin dinner and included her in holidays and never once said a cross word to her even when Tamsin was walking through our warehouse like she owned it, finally lost her composure. She said, "Tamsin, you've been in this family for 2 years. In those 2 years, you have never offered to help at a holiday. You have never asked me how I'm doing. You have never babysat for your nieces or volunteered to bring a dish or called on a Sunday just to talk. You have never shown up for anything that didn't involve the business or money. You showed up at the warehouse without permission. You demanded a job that didn't exist. You tried to take your sister-in-law's shares through a lawyer. And now you're telling me you know where you stand. Yes, you do. You stand exactly where you put yourself." My mother told me about this conversation later that evening. She said her hands were shaking the entire time. She said she'd never spoken to anyone like that. I said, "Mom, everything you said was true." She said, "I know. That's why my hands were shaking. The truth is heavier when you finally let it out." Tamsin hung up. That was the last time she spoke to my mother directly. She and Oakley stayed together. I'll give them that. Whatever happened between them after the letter, they didn't split. But Tamsin stopped coming to family events. She stopped showing up at the warehouse. She stopped calling my father. She stopped posting the company name on her social accounts. She stopped telling her friends she was part of a family empire. She disappeared from the family in a way that was both sudden and slow at the same time. Sudden because the calls and the visits stopped. Slow because the absence took months to fully register. I think she expected us to chase her. I think she expected someone to call and beg her to come back and say we were wrong and she was right and here are your shares. Nobody called. Nobody chased. The business kept running. The holidays kept happening. The family kept gathering. And the empty chair where Tamsin used to sit filled in the way empty chairs always do. You notice it for a while and then you stop noticing it and then one day you can't remember what the room looked like when it was occupied. Oakley started coming to dinners alone. He'd say Tamsin wasn't feeling well or that she had plans. Nobody pressed him. After a while, nobody asked at all. The company continued. I got promoted to vice president of operations the following year. My father started stepping back and letting me run the day-to-day. I hired 3 new drivers, restructured our delivery routes to reduce fuel costs by 11%, and renegotiated 2 supplier contracts that saved us $83,000 annually. I did all of this from the same warehouse floor where Tamsin had walked around in heels asking employees questions they didn't owe her answers to. Then we landed a $1.4 million contract with a regional developer that was the biggest deal in the company's history. I worked on that proposal for 6 weeks. I pulled the numbers, built the pitch deck, drove to the developer's office twice, and presented to a room of people who were used to dealing with men in their 50s and had to recalibrate when a 32-year-old woman walked in with a binder and a handshake. I signed it. My father stood behind me and watched. When I turned around after shaking hands with the developer, my father had tears in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. That nod was worth more than any speech. It was the same nod he gave me when I was 14 and correctly identified a shipping discrepancy on an invoice. The same nod he gave when I graduated college and told him I was coming back to work. The same nod he gave at Christmas when he handed me the ownership papers. My father didn't use a lot of words. He used nods, and every one of them meant the same thing. I see you. You earned this. I'm 34 now. now. The company did $6.2 million in revenue last year. We've expanded to a third warehouse and hired 12 new employees. I promoted one of our drivers to warehouse supervisor after he'd been with us for 15 years, and I sat in the same office my father used to sit in when I told him. He cried the same way I almost cried when my father gave me the nod after the $1.4 million contract. That's how you know a company has a soul, when the people inside it feel like they matter. Tamsin never understood that. She saw numbers on a spreadsheet and a bio she could change and a title she could give herself. She never saw the floor. My father still comes in 3 days a week, but mostly to drink coffee and walk around the floor and talk to the guys who've been there as long as he has. He tells the same stories about my grandfather and the truck and the first warehouse they rented in 1971 for $200 a month. Everyone has heard the stories. Nobody tells him to stop. The 15% stake he gave me that Christmas has been supplemented with an additional 10% I earned through a performance-based vesting schedule we agreed on with the company attorney. I own 25% of a business my grandfather built with a truck and a handshake in 1971. I earned it one invoice at a time. Oakley is still teaching. He's a good teacher by all accounts, and he seems happy in the way that people seem happy when they've stopped pretending to want something they never actually wanted. He and Tamsin had a baby last year, a girl. He brings her to family dinners sometimes, and my mother holds her and cries the way grandmothers do. Tamsin sends photos through Oakley's phone, but she doesn't come. I don't know if she's embarrassed or angry or indifferent. I don't think about it much. Last Thanksgiving, Oakley brought the baby and stayed late, and we sat on the porch after everyone else had gone inside. The baby was asleep in a carrier between us, and the air smelled like leftover turkey and cold grass. He looked at me and said, "I never said this properly, but I'm sorry." I said, "You don't have to apologize." He said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "I let someone convince me that what you earned should have been mine just because we share a last name and I should have known better." He said, "I watched you work every summer growing up, and I know how much of yourself you put into that place, and I had no right to let anyone tell me I deserved a piece of it." I told him he did know better. He just loved someone who didn't. He didn't argue with that. He looked down at the baby and said, "I want her to know her aunt. I want her to grow up seeing what you built and knowing that women can run things like that." I said, "Then bring her to the warehouse sometime." He smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen from him in a long time. Not the polite one he wore at family dinners when Tamsin was managing his expressions from across the table. A real one. We sat on the porch for a while longer and didn't talk. The warehouse lights were visible from my parents' house if you looked east past the tree line. I could see them from where I was sitting. 2 buildings and a parking lot and 53 years of a family business that started with a man and a truck. Tamsin wanted 30% of that. She got a letter from an attorney and a seat in the car on Christmas Eve. I got the keys.